Ladies and gentlemen, hello again, and welcome to another Reflected Reality Simulations video. My name is Graham, this is X-Plane 11 and the TorqueSim SR22. This is part 5 of the video series, and today we're going to take a look at the turbo-normalized version of the aircraft. In a lot of respects it's very similar to the naturally aspirated aircraft. Flying and navigation is almost exactly the same. The real differences, as you might expect, comes with the engine handling. And the good news is the turbo-normalized engine is a lot easier to operate for the majority of the flight envelope. There's only 2 or 3 places that we have to be particularly careful with the engine, and that's what we're going to look at in these videos. So we're at Grand Canyon Airport and we're going to fly down to Tucson, or just Ryan Field, just northwest of Tucson. Flight is about 250 nautical miles. We've got the fuel set to TABS fuel, so that's 30 gallons. And we've got 3 passengers and some baggage loaded. And with that we're already at the maximum takeoff weight on the aircraft. So it's a little bit more restrictive as far as weight and balance goes compared to the naturally aspirated aircraft. What's really important on the turbo-normalized aircraft is making sure that the oil temperature is warmed up properly before you take off. So at the moment the oil temperature is 156 Fahrenheit. I've found that departures at less than 160 are not ideal. It's to do with how the turbo system manages the manifold pressure. We'll have a look at that when we're airborne, but the important thing is that the turbo-normalized aircraft is different from the SR22T, the Cirrus turbo aircraft. With the turbo-normalized aircraft, it's still a full power lever forward takeoff. The power lever goes fully forward and the mixture is fully forward. We don't have to worry about regulating the manifold pressure. We're looking for 2700 RPM and 29.6 inches on the boost gauge, although that can go up to about 32 inches and that will generate a yellow manifold pressure caution. That's not a concern on the takeoff roll, that's to be expected. In fact, as the RPM winds up from 25 to 27, we may even see manifold pressure in red momentarily. Again, that's not a concern initially. We want to continue the takeoff and we'll sort that out once we're airborne if it persists as an issue. We may also get a transitory high manifold pressure fuel flow warning in yellow. Again, that only happens when we're setting the power, but just something to look out for. The flight plan's all loaded. This video is mostly about engine handling, but we're going to take off on runway 21, fly ahead to 7,000 feet and then pick up the navigation track on the GPS down towards Phoenix and then on towards Ryan. So it's all warmed up now, 161 Fahrenheit. I'll make the mixture full rich, check we've got flaps to take off. I'll put the landing lights on and the pitot heat on and we'll line up. So getting the engine warmed up is key. It's about 8 degrees Celsius outside and it's taken 15 minutes after engine start to warm up to temperature on this aircraft. So the speeds are the same as the naturally aspirated aircraft. We're rotating at 70 to 73 knots. And I'm just going to follow the flight directors on the climb out. You see the flight directors are in the go around mode. So one final check of the temperatures and pressures. All is good. I'll advance the power lever fully forward. There's the manifold pressure red and back to yellow. Keeping the aircraft straight ahead on the centre line. That's fine, we'll continue. 50 knots, 60 knots, 70, rotate. So just looking to fly the pitch attitude, keep the instrument panel just slightly below the horizon. Above 200 feet, above 80 knots, flaps up. I'll continue to follow the flight directors. Put autopilot on. And I'll put the aircraft into heading mode initially, and we'll go to IAS hold and target 120 knots. So I can do that with the wheel down here I've got keystrokes to make it easier in flight. So autopilot's on, in heading, flight level change, 120 knots. We've still got yellow manifold pressure. That's fine, that's because it's just slightly above the 29.6, but it's in the yellow arc, so we don't need to be concerned about it. The navigation track is just coming in at the moment from the right hand side of the aircraft, so to keep it simple I'll put us into nav and the aircraft will make a turn on course. You'll notice the fuel flow is very high at 35.7. This is a full reach of peak climb. With that in mind, we need to keep a close eye on the fuel imbalance. Going through 8,000 feet, I'm going to put the oxygen system on. I'm going to check in here and I'm going to set the little ball here up to about 13 for 13,000 feet for the initial cruise. That's all we really need to do with the engine. We can leave it there all the way up to 25,000 feet if we want to. We don't need to touch the mixture or the power lever. However, the fuel burn is very high. I'm doing a ground speed, or a true airspeed, sorry, of 140 odd knots, and I'm climbing at 1400 feet a minute, which is not bad at 9,000 feet. I'm just going to pull the mixture back using my keystrokes here, watch the fuel flow drop off. I'll do it gradually. We do get a caution for high manifold fuel flow, but I'll keep bringing the fuel flow back until it roughly gets in line with this this blue marker, this cyan marker on the fuel flow. And as long as the fuel flow is either at or below the blue marker or at the top of the green arc, you're not going to cause any damage to the engine. The high manifold pressure fuel flow warning is above the cyan marker and below the top of the green arc. So this area, as indicated with the mouse cursor here, is basically a keep out zone. We don't want to be in that. It hasn't affected the true airspeed one bit. We're still climbing at 140 knots true. It's just the rate of climb has backed off a little bit. But that's not the end of the world. Passing through 10,000 feet, we'll double check I've got the oxygen on, double check the setting on the regulator, and we can switch off the landing light. I'll just straighten up the heading bug as well. Now we can climb lean of peak all the way up to 18,000 feet. The ceiling on this aircraft is 25,000 feet. Actually, let me just put the yaw damper on as well. So a lean of peak climb is acceptable at the lower altitudes as long as we keep an eye on the engine temperatures, the cylinder head temperatures. If necessary, I can increase the speed that we're climbing at to 130 knots, and that will improve the cooling ever so slightly. What's important to understand is that because we're turbo-normalized, we're still getting effectively sea level pressure. You see the manifold pressures come back now to 29.6, this warning should just be on the verge of going out. But this is effectively sea level pressure. If we've got sea level air being presented to the engine, then we've also got sea level fuel burn and sea level fuel flow. So although it's leaned out for the climb, we're still burning 17 gallons an hour. Now the naturally aspirated aircraft, when it got to 13,000 feet, it was only burning in the region of 11 to 12 gallons per hour, and its true airspeed was 160 knots. So we're very similar to that at the moment. True airspeed is 154, but our fuel flow is a lot higher. What's important to understand with a turbocharged or a supercharged piston aircraft, the altitude doesn't make a huge difference to the fuel economy. All it changes is the true airspeed, so you'll fly slightly faster at a high altitude, but you don't have the same fuel savings as you would have in a turbine climbing up to high altitude. So if 13,000 feet presented favourable tailwinds and there weren't any terrain issues, then that would be ideal for a cruise on this aircraft. If you need to, you've got the capability to go up a lot higher, but unlike a turbine aircraft, you shouldn't always target the highest possible altitude. Just find an altitude that works for favourable winds and for the en route or for the routing that you want to use. You see it's climbing quite happily at 500 feet a minute. Burning all that extra fuel, doubling my fuel burn, would only increase my rate of climb. It wouldn't make me go any faster. So I'm doing 9 miles per gallon at the moment, rather than about 4.5 miles per gallon. It also means that fuel imbalance takes a little bit longer to develop. Because the mixture's set, even lean of peak, I don't need to worry about the mixture all the way up to 18,000 feet. I can quite happily climb lean of peak to 18,000 feet without adjusting the mixture or adjusting the power lever. I mentioned the SR22T rather than the TN. The T model, the Cirrus developed turbocharging system, is not turbo-normalized. It can provide more than sea level pressure. It also locks the RPM to 2500 regardless of what you do with the power lever. So you have to be more mindful of the boost on that aircraft. With this aircraft, it should be more or less, you can do exactly what you want to do with it. You don't have to worry in the early stages of the flight about overboosting it. This manifold pressure is just a caution to tell you it's running slightly above the 29.6. And once we level off at 13,000 feet, we'll have a look at why that might be. This is beautiful scenic northern Arizona. We've got Humphreys Peak over here, Flagstaff just behind, and the Grand Canyon behind us. So those CHTs are dropping off quite nicely now. So lean of peak is a very efficient way to climb the aircraft. And we're not impacting our flight duration. There's no terrain ahead of us that we need to climb over, so there's no need to burn all that extra fuel for a rich of peak climb. So that's 1,000 feet to go. Just check the fuel. I'll change the fuel tanks over, so we've got 17.1 gallons per hour, boost pumps on, changing tanks, still 17.1, and everything's fine. Whilst we're climbing, have a look at my colleague on the right here. You see he's wearing this device up his nose. This is a cannula delivering oxygen directly into his nose, so he can still use his microphone without wearing a mask. He can still keep his sunglasses on. These cannulas are only allowed to be used up to 18,000 feet. Above 18,000 feet you must wear a full mask. Now that's not visually simulated in the aircraft, but if you have a look on the regulator, this side here, the oxygen side, is for the cannula, and this side here is for the mask. So if he was wearing a mask, I'd want to have the setting up here for 13, and because I'm eventually going to go up to 25, I'm just going to increase that flow up to 25. Now that adds another dynamic to operating the Cirrus aircraft at high altitudes, that you have to be aware if you're doing a long cross-country flight, if the destination you're going to has the ability to refill your oxygen as well, because the oxygen is consumed the same as the TKS fluid is consumed, as well as the gasoline is consumed. So it's just another fluid, another replenishment you've got to make plans for at your destination. But you can see how, now that we're airborne and climbing away, the SR22TN is largely trouble-free. There's nothing we need to worry about overly. It's interesting that there are no rich of peak cruise figures for this aircraft. The intention with it is always to cruise lean of peak, and I think it's 17.3 to 17.6 is your ideal lean of peak fuel burn. We don't want to cruise at 2700 RPM, we want to bring it back to 2500 RPM. Remember, on the real aircraft there's not a detent but more a pressure point you can feel when you've got to the point you're only affecting the manifold pressure. We don't have that luxury in the sim, so rather than coming back to 2500, I'm going to come back to 2510, and that tells me I've got the power lever as far forward as possible for maximum manifold, but far enough back to get me roughly 2500 RPM. So there we go, just leveling off at 13,000 feet. It's starting to accelerate, and I'll start bringing the power back. Now as I reduce the RPM, you may see the manifold pressure fluctuate. You may see it increase and then decrease. That's to be expected. I'm making very smooth power changes with the turbocharged aircraft. So there's 25, 20, 25, 10. I'll just pop that out for a moment and I'll adjust my fuel flow so that adjust the mixture, sorry, so the fuel flow is around about the cyan marker there. There's no warnings from the aircraft now. We're leaned out for 13,000 foot cruise. And remember, the naturally aspirated aircraft was doing 160 knots true and burning 11.3 gallons per hour. We are now doing 17.3, but we should get closer to about 190 knots. So it's definitely faster, but it's a bit more thirsty across country. We're going to end up about 11 nautical miles per gallon as opposed to 14 nautical miles per gallon. That has an impact on the range, and also the fact that with 3 people and some bags on board, you can't really fill the fuel tanks as full as you could on the naturally aspirated aircraft. It has an impact on the mission capability, but for a single pilot, it's ideal. So you can see we're going to get roughly about 190 knots. You can see that economy is just creeping up. So let's continue the climb. Let's go from 13,000 feet up to 25,000 feet. So I'll just wind the archer in first of all. I'll put it into IS hold initially, so flight level change. I'll bring the power back up, so I'm looking for 2700 RPM. And I just need to adjust the fuel flow. See, I've got the high manifold pressure warning there. High manifold pressure fuel flow, so I'm just reducing the fuel flow to keep it comfortably on the lean side. And then what I'll do is I'll start bringing the selected speed back, and that'll ease the aircraft into the climb. So we're back to where we were before, 2700 RPM, 17-ish gallons per hour, and we're going to climb at between, well, probably 130 knots indicated. It'll zoom up a little bit and then it will maintain 130 knots. Before I go too much further though, because I'm going above 18, I want to transition back to a rich of peak climb. So I'm going to move the mixture forward and keep an eye on the fuel flow gauge here. I'm going to move it in small movements, but not delaying it in this danger area here. So we get the high manifold fuel flow. And once the mixture is fully forward, that warning goes away again, and the climb rate improves quite a bit. I'm climbing up to flight level, so I'll put the altimeter into standard baro as well. So let's try and understand how that turbocharging system is working with this engine. If I bring up the schematic for the engine, and I'll keep the primary flight display in my scan as well. Notice that manifold pressure's creeped up again. So at the front of the engine, the air intake is very similar. You've got a filter on the front and you've got the 2 inlets. You've got 6 cylinders, 3 on one side, 3 on the other, and 2 turbochargers. The system is basically symmetrical. So the airflow comes in from the front and it enters the compressor section of the turbo. It then goes through this grey shaded pipe here, so it's higher pressure air. In this aircraft it's called the upper deck. It's basically where the compressed air lives. It comes through an intercooler to reduce the charge temperature, and then it comes through a throttle body. That's basically the same throttle body you would have on any other naturally aspirated aircraft. Note the pressure relief valve here. If you grew up in the 1970s through to the 1990s and you're a bit of a petrol head, a bit of a gearhead, you may have enjoyed television footage of turbocharged rally cars flying through forests and through deserts, and you'll hear when they change gear there's a chirp or a tweet from the turbo system on the aircraft, on the car, and various different commentators would refer to that as the wastegate. But in actual fact it's not. It's a pressure relief valve which is on the intake side. The wastegate is actually down here on the exhaust side. That pressure relief valve is almost like an emergency overpressure vent. It's there to guard the inlet system from any harm. So this high pressure air is admitted into the cylinders, combusted and then ejected through the turbine or through the wastegate and back out through the exhaust. What's important to understand is the pressure in the upper deck is regulated by the pressure controller. And on the SR22TN, it's an absolute pressure controller. That means it always targets the same pressure. It doesn't adjust the pressure based on what the aircraft's doing. So it's always targeting a pressure of, I think it's about 31 to 33 inches of mercury, just above sea level pressure. It does that through the wastegate actuator here, which drives the wastegate. Now what the wastegate does is it allows some exhaust gas to pass by the compressor, pass by the turbine, sorry, and not drive the turbine. The default case is for this wastegate to be fully open, so the maximum amount of exhaust gas will bypass the turbine and not spin up the turbo. So to pressurize the upper deck, to achieve the upper deck pressure, the wastegate actuator is signaled by the controller to close the wastegate valve. And it does that using engine oil pressure. The engine oil pressure comes out from the engine, through the actuator, back through to the controller, and then it vents it into the engine sump. It follows therefore that the behaviour of the wastegate controller, the wastegate actuator, is very dependent on the oil pressure. If the oil pressure is too high, it's going to close or force this wastegate closed for too long. And if the oil pressure is too low, it won't hold the wastegate closed for long enough. So with a very high oil pressure, it'll force more air through the turbine than the controller really wants, which will push it to a higher upper deck pressure. And that's exactly what we're seeing at the moment, and indeed what we saw on the takeoff roll. You see, we're up here at 18,000 feet and the temperature is minus 16. And we started at 7,000 feet and it was only 8 degrees. So the oil hasn't fully warmed up. The oil pressure is just marginally higher than what the design setting is for the aircraft. So that higher oil pressure is holding this wastegate here, it's holding it closed a little bit more. It's not allowing enough gas to pass through the bypass here. It's forcing more gas to go through the turbine, which is driving the turbine harder, driving the compressor harder, and producing a higher pressure in the upper deck. I hope all that makes sense. And you also remember on the takeoff roll, the manifold pressure momentarily went from a yellow warning to a red warning. The manifold pressure had gone above 32 inches. Remember I said that the SR22T, the in-house turbocharged aircraft, had the RPM limited to 25, but this is a Tornado Alley conversion. It was done in the factory for a number of years by Cirrus, but it's essentially an aftermarket conversion. You still have 25 and 2700 RPM available to you. So when the engine is accelerating, when you're applying power, and the RPM goes from 25 up to 2700, you instantly get a significant gain in the gas flow through the exhaust. As the RPM increases, the amount of gas being expelled in the exhaust cycle increases. So you get an almost instantaneous increase in the gas flow. The wastegate has to respond to that. The wastegate has to open a little bit more to take some of the air that was going through the turbine and allow it to bypass. It has to reduce the pressure in the actuator, but it takes a while for that response to happen. You see, the regulator is controlled on the return side, so the oil has to get all the way through the system, all the way to the actuator, and then all the way back again. It reduces the pressure here. That pressure change takes a while, not a long time, but a reasonable amount of time to propagate back to the actuator. And even when it's made that change at the actuator, that's changing the amount of air. It's allowing or forcing less air over the turbine. There's still a lot of inertia in these turbines, so they're still spinning away, still producing that pressure. It takes a while for the turbocharger to spin down and stop producing that high pressure. So that's why we've got the momentary red caution on the takeoff roll. Not something to be concerned about. If the aircraft is up at operating temperature and you get a red manifold pressure warning, then yes, that is definitely something that's not quite right. If you routinely operate the aircraft in cold temperatures where your oil pressure doesn't quite come down far enough, you have the option on the maintenance screen to adjust the manifold pressure target, that's something your engineer would do for you. If you operate in really hot temperatures, you might need to increase that a little bit. If you operate at really cool temperatures, you may have to reduce that setting a little bit. But the big takeaway for the climb on the SR22TN is it's a full power, full forward on the mixture, 2700 RPM climb. Even if it says manifold pressure in yellow, as long as it's not excessive, as long as it's not above 32, you don't have to worry about it, as long as you can explain that. Now if your oil temperature is up 200 and your oil pressure is low and you get a high manifold pressure, then something's not quite right. But as it is at the moment, with that slightly elevated oil pressure, I'm not concerned at all about that 29.6 versus 29.7. So I hope that all that makes sense. There's Humphrey's Peak behind us now, and the Sedona area down here, Flagstaff's just over here. It's very good at making progress. You can cross country very quickly on this aircraft. So just another 3 or 4 minutes until we level off. It's always worth double checking that your oxygen flow is as expected. 25,000 feet on there. And in real life you'd probably wear the oxygen meter on your finger just to make sure that your sats were satisfactory for high altitude cruise. One of the other things to bring your attention to for these really high altitude operations is the fact that your structural cruising speed, your VNO, that's where the green band becomes a yellow band, actually changes at high altitude. It works out to be, I think it's about 3 knots change for every 1,000 feet above 17.5. Now the real aircraft, it will adjust the yellow band on the PFD. This aircraft doesn't do that, this model doesn't do that, but it's important to remember that at 25,000 feet your structural cruising speed is only 150 knots indicated. So we're not really that far off that. We have to be careful as we accelerate into the cruise. And the cruise we'll see is very close to the structural cruising limit. Just looking at my fuel levels there, all is well. I'll pop it back, check the boost pressures there, back onto the left hand side, and we're good. One of the other things about this aircraft is you've got the option of latching in high boost pressure as well as regular boost pressure. It's not just a prime function. So if you get erratic fuel flow, you may be getting vaporization in the fuel system, especially if you get very high temperature fuel or high ambient conditions. We're not likely to see it today, but you've got the option of putting it into high boost if necessary. And once you put it onto high boost, you simply have to adjust the mixture to keep the fuel flow where it needs to be. It's always going to be a lean of peak cruise, remember. When we enter the cruise, we always bring the mixture back to lean of peak, and we cruise at 2500 RPM. What we mustn't do at high altitude is make a big power reduction. We'll talk a little bit about that in the second video, but in simple terms, if we keep the manifold pressure above 25 inches at all points during the high altitude flight, then we'll be okay. We've just got to be making gentle power reductions and not running for a long time at a low power setting. It can cause issues. So 1,000 feet to go. You see the CHTs haven't been a problem throughout this climb, either lean of peak or rich of peak. As long as you climb at 130 knots, it's usually okay. In high ambient temperatures, you may have to increase the speed to 140. Just keep an eye on it. But remember, down at 13,000 feet, we were doing, what was it, 11 miles per gallon, I think? And we were doing 190 true airspeed. So we'll be a little bit faster up here. Let's see how it goes. So remember, I've got 20 knots before we exceed the structural cruising speed. I level off, I'll make a gradual power reduction, bringing the RPM back, so I'm looking for 2510, and then I'll just gradually start bringing the mixture back with my key binding. High manifold pressure fuel flow, that's telling you you're in the danger zone with the engine. I want to keep bringing the mixture back until it gets roughly to that cyan marker there and the warning goes away. If I pop that out, we can refine that. Usually about 17.3 works. But there we are, cruising along at 25,000 feet. And we're looking at a fuel flow that was identical to 13,000 feet. Yeah, it's going a little bit faster. We can go maybe another 4 or 5 knots faster, but then we start to get into the structural cruising speed limitations there. You can go beyond it in smooth air, but you don't know what kind of air you're going to encounter. So I would always keep it in the green arc, below 150. And it's going to work out to be 12.5 miles per gallon. So it's slightly more efficient at high altitude, it's slightly faster at high altitude. But really, a 20 knot tailwind would make all the difference. There's no point climbing up to 25,000 feet to encounter a 20 knot headwind if you can have a tailwind at 13,000 feet. That being said, the altitude capability is very good for getting across terrain, or maybe choosing a better airways routing that wouldn't have been available to you at a lower altitude. I hope all that makes sense. The turbo-normalizing aircraft is fascinating to operate, simply because in a lot of respects it's very straightforward as long as you understand how the turbo-normalizing system operates. In the next video we'll look at the descent and the landing into Ryan. We're going to fly the RNAV approach into Ryan. I hope you'll join me for that. If you do have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comment section below. Otherwise, I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thanks very much for watching.